Anyone who lived near the old Bakersby Lane recognized the meadow as a barren patch of land where nothing much ever happened. In daylight, the grass was always parched, and patches of nettles dotted the field in irregular clusters. The few rotting fence posts surrounding it were relics from a distant time when the area had been farmland. Closer to the forest's edge, the ground dipped slightly into a shallow pit, its purpose long forgotten. No one had set foot there for years, not voluntarily, and certainly not after sunset. 2 weeks ago, rumors began spreading that a strange structure had appeared overnight in that very meadow. Vague descriptions teased the imagination. Some said they'd seen a tall scaffolding with twisted metal rods and hanging carts. Others claimed it was a carousel that whirled in an endless circle without music. No one could explain why it made no sound, nor how it came to be. These were stories whispered over dinner tables by uneasy families, or passed from child to child as dares. The meadow was too desolate, too soaked in centuries of uneasy silence, for such a thing to exist without cause. Its presence was first observed at dusk. A farmer returning home took a shortcut through the meadow, a place he usually avoided, but he was in a hurry to escape the creeping darkness. Pausing at the sight, he saw a silhouette swaying silently in the still evening air. Though his heart hammered heavily in his chest, he felt compelled to take a few more steps. In the gathering twilight, the structure's details solidified. A fair ride suspended by long metal chains with seats that dangled ominously. Each chain attached to a central pillar, giving the impression of a nightmarish beast ready to spin with unstoppable force. The farmer could see no lights, hear no laughter, nor sense any semblance of joy that a fair ride might usually bring. Instead, he felt a pressing gloom around him, as though the air had thickened, trying to push him back. He claimed to have heard an unholy whisper, faint and hissing, but by the time he realized his ears might be playing tricks, his legs had locked, refusing to approach the contraption. In blind terror, he tore himself away and ran, stumbling over weeds and thistles until he reached the relative safety of the lane. His story spread fast, but it was met by the usual dismissals: exhaustion, imagination, a confused recollection of shapes and shadows. Still, a strange hush fell over the village. People started bolting their doors a little earlier each evening, making excuses to stay indoors rather than venture into the night. Yet, curiosity is a powerful thing, and soon enough, 2 local teenagers ventured out to see if the farmer's tale held any truth. Armed with flashlights and a sense of daring, they set foot in the marked field after sunset. They found it, sure enough. The ride's steel beams glinted dully under the moonlight, and its chain-linked seats shifted eerily in the breeze. One of them, a tall boy by the name of Henry, stepped up to it. He called out, partly to calm his own nerves and partly in mock invitation. The words died in his throat as the seat closest to him swayed violently, but there was no wind at that moment. His companion, Francis, insisted they should leave, but a stubborn thrill in Henry's mind urged him to climb on board, for the briefest of moments, just for the adrenaline rush. The seat was cold, as though it had been locked in a coffin of ice. The chain felt as if it had been pulled from a bottomless well, slick to the touch and still dripping with ghostly condensation. The instant Henry settled onto it, the entire ride lurched, groaning as ancient gears turned from deep within the earth. Frances backed up, her voice caught in her throat. Seconds later, the ride began to swing. It went slowly at first, as though waking from a long slumber. Each chain grinding in place, but faster. It cut a wide arc in the rotting meadow grass, sending Henry in repetitive passes through the chilly air. Frances watched in both terror and fascination as the tall pillars of the ride came to life, turning with impossible motion. She didn't see what powered it, what forced it to spin and elevate, but it definitely rose, carrying Henry with it. She was seized by a horror that rooted her feet to the spot. Henry was hanging on, but he wasn't screaming. Instead, his eyes were wide open, his face gray as though in shock. She shouted his name, but the mechanical howling of the spinning pillar swallowed her pleas. Wrenching her eyes from Henry for just a second, she caught sight of something else. Shapes, moving in the darkness beyond the ride's edge, slender outlines fluttering like shredded cloth. They appeared to watch her with glowing hollows where eyes should have been. Henry's seat rotated toward the highest point, and he could see the entirety of the meadow. But what he saw wasn't just the meadow. A rift seemed to tear open in the space overhead. From his perch, Henry glimpsed a distorted world filled with twisting spires and luminous, throbbing orbs that illuminated swarming skeletal figures. There were cold, unearthly lights that flashed like dying stars. A disquieting hum seeped into his bones, and for a moment he was sure that if he looked long enough, the apparitions might decide to reach across that boundary and drag him into their world. Francis could only watch helplessly from below. The ride sped, shrieking like metal scraping across a gravestone. She had no choice but to risk climbing onto a seat herself, hoping to stop the mad contraption or find some way to rescue Henry. The moment she touched the chain, something seemed to crawl across her skin, a sensation of tiny claws pricking her flesh. Her seat jerked, swinging violently as though a giant had taken hold of it. Then the world blurred. The field spun beneath her, transforming into a green-brown whirl of sinking shapes. Above, the night sky fractured into strange lines like the cracks in old porcelain. As the ride lifted her higher, she found herself face to face with the very other Henry was beginning to see. She gasped. The air was different there, heavier, and the sky, if it could be called that, was filled with shadows that rustled with a sentient hunger. She smelled it before she truly saw it, a stench of decay, as though 1,000 graves had been exhumed in a single night. Frances tried to shut her eyes, but some irresistible force pried them open. She had to behold what lay beyond the veil. There, she caught flashes of nightmares, swirling storms of black dust, indescribable creatures folding in on themselves, whispering in a language that resembled the scraping of fingernails on chalkboards. She realized with mounting dread that these beings were acutely aware of her. In the center of that demonic panorama stood a massive gateway, shaped like an arch of bone and obsidian. A throng of pale, elongated figures clustered around it. They extended their spidery arms through a churning portal that separated their twisted dimension from her own. Frances's heart battered her ribs as she realized they were reaching for her. And while her body remained trapped on the seat, twisting in dizzying loops, her mind was reeling into that other world. Henry was no longer visible in the chaos. She glimpsed only fleeting shapes, maybe his feet dangling, or the back of his head as he soared in and out of view. The ride kept accelerating, drawn by some cosmic power. Flames licked at the corners of Frances's vision, only to be replaced by roiling shadows. She couldn't differentiate which dimension she was in. The two realities had begun to merge in relentless union. She heard wailing from every direction, some of it hers, some of it belonging to Henry, and some of it distinctly inhuman. She lost count of how many times her seat surged upward, granting horrific glimpses of that dreadful dimension, before plunging back into the mortal realm. At last, the ride began to slow, a creaking, scraping, whimpering sound, as though the monstrous entity controlling it had briefly tired. Frances felt her seat sink groundward, and in that moment, the night air returned to something resembling normal. The lights in the sky flickered and vanished. The sense of suffocating dread ebbed, just enough for her to gasp in true fresh air. When the seat touched the grass, she slid off and collapsed. Despite the adrenaline charging through her, her limbs felt drained of all strength. She forced her gaze upward, searching desperately for Henry, only to see him slump off his seat. He landed face down with a muted thud. He scrambled to his side, tears streaming. Henry's eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on something that only he could see. His lips moved, mumbling about dark corridors and endless screams. Frances did her best to shake him to his senses, but it was as though a curtain had severed him from reality. She managed to half drag, half carry him away from the ride's perimeter. The instant they crossed an invisible threshold, the air changed. The hume silenced, and the faint shapes she had glimpsed melted into the gloom. She stared back, her whole body aching with terror. That thing still loomed behind them, seats quietly swaying. Before she could think it through, Frances began to run, with Henry's arm slung across her shoulder, stumbling back to the main road, determined to get him somewhere safe. Word spread quickly of their misadventure. Frances tried explaining to her aunt, a devout woman who refused to believe in dark spirits, that they had truly seen something not of this world. Henry, for his part, spoke in short bursts of sense, followed by fits of trembling. He mentioned a door in the sky, a swirling realm of nightmares, and a voice that sang in his ear, beckoning him to return. Doctors examined him, diagnosing shock, or no one could have guessed at the real truth behind his condition. Curiosity among the villagers only grew. Where fear lurked, fascination also thrived. Small groups began sneaking to the meadow at odd hours, eager to see if the spectral ride was truly there. Some returned wide-eyed, claiming that it had vanished like a mirage. Others swore they glimpsed its spindly outline and felt a terrible presence before fleeing at the first creak of its rusted beams. Each new whisper added to a mounting tension, a malaise that hung over the village. Frances refused to let what had happened pass without answers. She wanted to destroy the ride if possible, or at least banish it back to wherever it had come from. She sought advice from the local priest, but he mumbled half-remembered fables of cursed crossroads and wandering spirits, uncertain how they might apply. A traveling historian, hearing the rumors, suggested there were references in old texts to a devil's playground, a cursed carnival attraction rumored to appear on blood-soaked ground. If enough doom and grief plagued a location, some monstrous gateway could open. Desperate for any hope, Frances consulted a dusty volume the historian had brought, which detailed alleged sightings of cursed fair rides throughout centuries in remote parts of Europe. They always emerged in times of despair, luring souls to witness impossible horrors. Each account described a terrible cost that the rite exacted upon those who dared board it. But the book offered no practical instructions for banishment, only dire warnings to avoid it at all costs. Nevertheless, Frances set out one cold, cloudy evening with a lantern and a flask of holy water blessed by the priest. Though he remained unsure about its power, determined to put an end to this phenomenon, she returned to the meadow alone. The wind whipped her hair across her eyes, and the grass hissed as it swayed in the dark. Sure enough, the ride was there, silent and still, waiting like a predator. She saw the faint glimmer of twisted metal, the dull shapes of seats hanging in the gloom. Taking a steadying breath, she walked slowly toward it, the lantern casting flickering patterns on the ground. She remembered the boundary she and Henry had crossed, that eerie threshold that changed reality's texture. Her next step brought an immediate chill. Her breath fogged in the air. The seats began to jangle in some phantom gust. Lightly she sprinkled the holy water across the ride's base, muttering a prayer. The response was immediate. She heard a hiss similar to steam erupting from an overpressured boiler, and the chains trembled. For a flicker of her heartbeat, she felt a surge of hope that she could chase away whatever malignant spirit powered this monstrosity. But that hope withered as a rending sound tore through the meadow. The central support rattled with ferocious energy, and the seats began rotating, one by one, clanking into motion. Frances cried out, stepping back. She tried to continue sprinkling the water, but an unseen force knocked the flask from her hand, sending it spinning into the darkness. The ride twisted, its structure bending in ways that defied normal law. The central post seemed to melt, elongating into a crooked spire. The seats lifted of their own volition, swirling in a dance of fury. An unearthly screech rose around Frances, drowning out her heartbeat. Instinct screamed at her to run, but something pinned her feet. The seats, though spinning above, felt as though they reached ghostly chains deep into the ground, binding her in place. Her lantern flickered, revealing flickers of that other dimension. The swirling shadows coalesced into forms that teemed just beyond the threshold. She caught glimpses of eyes, so many eyes blazing with malevolence or hunger. A single seat cracked open at its seam, revealing a hollow interior filled with black, roiling fluid. A slithering, inky mass dripped from it, forming shapes that writhed on the grass. Frances gagged, stumbling backward to escape its touch. Tears of frustration sparkled in her eyes. She called out to the swirling mass, demanding it leave this place, cursing it for what it had done to Henry and the rest of them. In answer, the ride's shrieking rose to an unbearable pitch, and branches of electricity danced across the metal scaffolding. The meadow's grass flattened in a circle around the apparatus, as though pressed by an invisible weight. With a final moan, a breach opened overhead, exactly as Frances had witnessed that first night. She was forced to look up, a puppet at the mercy of invisible strings. Her eyes locked onto that swirling, decayed landscape. The massive arch and the swarming shapes reappeared in horrifying clarity, and now they seemed closer, one step away from fully crossing into her world. This time, their outlines drifted downward, elongated heads and scythe-like limbs swaying in slow, purposeful motion. She felt a dryness in her mouth. Terror found a nest in her veins, and her body froze in primal dread. Something akin to an arm, dripping black goo, stretched out from the swirling above, nearing the apex of the ride, making contact with the highest seat as it swung. A sound like cracking bones resonated through the meadow. In that moment, Frances mustered the last vestige of her courage. With a shaky hand, she lifted the lantern. She'd lost the holy water. Her voice was on the brink of failing. But she had fire. She hurled the lantern straight at the base of the ride. The lantern shattered on impact, splashing burning oil over the metal contraption. Flames leapt hungrily, climbing the scaffold, licking at the chains. An unholy roar quaked out from the structure, as if it were alive. The dimension above rippled as though disturbed by that fury. Frances, now unrooted, dove back, praying that the blaze would consume whatever forced the ride to exist. She heard more snapping, tortured shrieks that rang out in both the mortal world and the dimension beyond. For a horrifying moment, it seemed the flames would only reveal the true shape of the horror, but then the top section creaked, caving under the heat. Metal gave way, seats tumbled, clanging heavily in the grass. Thick, black smoke poured from unseen vents in the center pole, and an acidic stench that made Frances's eyes water filled the air. The swirling shapes overhead began to recede, as though recoiling from the pure violence of fire. The chain seats twisted on the ground, some half submerged in a boiling tar-like substance that seemed to bleed out of the ride. With a final crash, the entire structure collapsed under its own weight, sinking into the meadow's soft earth. Frances choked on the smoke, crawling back until she was free of the acrid haze. She watched the destructive inferno claim the ride's twisted scaffolding. Flickers of phantom green and purple light danced within the flames, as if the dimension beyond was being dragged down with it. The final remnants of the contraption leaned to one side, collapsed, and then sank slowly into the ground, leaving only a scorched patch of dirt. Frances could scarcely believe her eyes. Her trembling hands pressed against the cool night grass to steady herself. A hush fell on the meadow, broken only by crackling embers and her own ragged breathing. She scanned the sky, half expecting to see that portal still lurking. But it was gone. Only the quiet stars dotted the firmament. Whatever had powered the ride seemed to have retreated into the shadows, or perhaps returned to its cursed domain, robbed of its foothold in her world. She didn't dare remain in that meadow. With tears streaking her soot-covered face, Frances forced herself to rise. She staggered through the blackened grass, hands shaking in relief as the sense of oppression finally lifted. Although her entire body throbbed with exhaustion, she wouldn't feel safe until the ruined silhouette of the ride and its invasive dimension were nothing but a memory behind her. When she arrived back at the village, dawn was just cresting the horizon. A few watchful neighbors saw the ghostly figure she made, covered in ash and panting for breath. Wordlessly, they gathered around, listening as Frances explained what had happened. Some found her tale too wild, but they saw her scorched clothes, smelled the acrid ash that clung to her hair, and realized no one could fabricate such terror. Henry, still fragile, was awakened by the commotion. He gripped Frances's hand, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. She told him that the ride was destroyed, though she couldn't say if those otherworldly horrors were gone for good. He didn't speak, but something haunted in his gaze seemed to ease, if only slightly. Some part of him recognized they had escaped a sinister fate. Perhaps in time he might recover fully. Hope appeared in the faint light of his eyes. No one dared attempt to find the remains of the contraption. Those who ventured to the meadow in the coming days found a scorched circle, its center barred by an unearthly black tar that refused to dry and emitted a pungent, noxious smell. Grass around the perimeter had begun to wither, browning at the tips like a ripple of malevolence. Animals skirted the area, refusing to graze there. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow across that patch of land. In the following weeks, rumors spread once again. Some believed the threat was over, that Frances's act of courageous defiance had vanquished the evil. Others whispered that the dimension's influence still lurked there, waiting for another surge of hopelessness to birth a new horror under the moonlight. Occasional travelers passing near the meadow reported a faint hum or glimpsed the faint outline of swaying seats. Most villagers stayed far away, refusing to sacrifice their peace of mind to a cursed place that had nearly claimed two among them. Frances, battered by nightmares, felt unsettled, as if the ride's destruction might be temporary. The singed patch in the meadow stood like a reminder that darkness can wear many shapes. Sometimes, when dusk settled in, she would close her eyes and recall the massive opening in the sky, the rows of gleaming eyes, and the dissonant wail of that firelit metal. Though she prayed that no one else would ever witness it, she couldn't fully banish the suspicion that somewhere another damned carnival might be rising from unholy soil. Eventually, life resumed its quiet pace, with people more focused on the turning of seasons and the harvest. Time made local memories less vivid, though Henry's hollow gaze and Frances's quiet unease remained a lingering testament. Through her experience, she had learned just how thin the veil really was. Darkness needed only the smallest crack to pour into the mortal realm, and in that old meadow, the crack had run deeper than anyone dared admit. Some said the nightmares would fade, that the ephemeral presence was torn apart by the scorching flames. Others prophesied it would manifest again in another forsaken place, feeding on the lost hopes of unsuspecting souls. But for now, the meadow seemed nearly ordinary by daylight, the shadows short and unthreatening. Only at night did its sinister echo rise, carried on the breeze that rustled the charred grasses with a soft rasp. No sign remained of the once terrifying fair ride, that ghostly contraption that granted horrifying glimpses into a realm best left unseen. But if you listened carefully enough on nights when the moon was new, you might hear metallic chains rattling in the distance, a half-remembered lullaby of terror carried by the wind. And somewhere between this dimension and the next, echoes of laughter both hungry and hollow ring out, yearning to meet the ears of anyone brave or foolish enough to venture into the dark.